I think we should start and just welcome our audience who are here for this great occasion where we have some extraordinary scholars, individuals who can elaborate on the enormous contribution of A.B. Spellman to our community. And I'm here as Sharon Pratt, the founding director of the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. We're housed on the campus of the State University, the University of the District of Columbia, and the Institute was started in 2019, essentially by Mayor Bowser and the president of UDC, President Ronald Mason. And what the purpose of it is to rediscover the history of Washington, D.C. Now, most of us, if you go on Google, those that can, you will, if you Google books about Washington, D.C., you'll get books about monuments. But people don't really know the history of the people and the culture and the character of this extraordinary community. We were created out of political whole cloth when the country was founded. Once it was established, they had to have a capital. We were the town of George and a little bit more than that. We weren't anything until they really wanted to establish this capital, this political capital, and it was a result of a political compromise. I won't go into all of the elements of it, but a large impetus for establishing the capital here along the banks of the Potomac, the South, had everything to do with many of the founding fathers wanting to protect their net worth, and their net worth was tied, unfortunately, to the institution of slavery. And so that's how we began. And so what we want to do, though, through the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, and is through our Resident Fellows program, is to really look at and harvest a lot of that history, the many dimensions of our city. And there is no more prolific resident fellow than Ethelbert Miller. And he has a great, exciting program tonight of extraordinary people from around the globe. We're here in Washington and other parts of America, and we're even here from China. So with that, I turn it over to our esteemed colleague, Ethelbert Miller.
Thank you, Mayor Pratt. April is National Poetry Month. April is also National Jazz Appreciation Month. We celebrate both today by honoring A.B. Spellman. In 1965, the Poets Press in New York City published The Beautiful Days by A.B. Spellman. The introduction to this collection was written by Frank O'Hara. The first thing O'Hara said about this book was, Spellman writes lean, strong, sexy poems. He would go on to mention how Spellman cuts through a lot of contemporary nonsense. In many ways, nonsense is still contemporary. So we turn to A.B. Spellman, again, requesting more beautiful days. Maybe everything should begin with A.B., followed by C. C standing for perhaps communion and community. This evening is a gathering of jazz folks and folks who love and have learned from A.B. Spellman, the teacher, the jazz critic, arts administrator, and author of the classic Black Music 4 Lives. There is much we can say about this man. Maybe we might be here for a spell. Our program is divided into 2 parts. The first part was inspired by the work of Willa Jenkins, who recently edited Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. I put together a quartet to talk about A.B. Spellman, as well as the importance of jazz in our city and country. The quartet consists of Maurice Jackson on bass, Willa Jenkins on piano, Eugene Holly on trumpet, and Bobby Hills on drums. Maurice Jackson is the editor of DC Jazz, Stories of Jazz Music in Washington, D.C. He edited this book with Blair Rubel. Jackson teaches history and African-American studies at Georgetown University. Willa Jenkins is the co-author of African Rhythms, the autobiography of Randy Weston. Jenkins is also the editor of Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. Eugene Holly Jr. is a Delaware bass writer. He has written for Publishers Weekly, Jazz Times, and Downbeat Magazine. Bobby Hill is the co-founder of Transparent production, presenting aberrant forms of jazz. For 33 years, Hill was at WPFW Radio, where for 2 years he served as the station's program director. The second part of our program will feature Lori Shire. Shire and A.B. Spellman, and A.B. Spellman. Lori will talk about A.B.'s poetry, and then A.B. will talk and share a few of his poems with us. Lori Shire wrote the introduction to Spellman's forthcoming book, Between the Night and Its Music, which is coming out from Wesleyan University Press. Lori Shire is a distinguished professor of English and founding director of the presidentially chartered Center for Contemporary Poetry and Poetics at California State University. But she joins us today from the Hunan Normal University in China. She's also the co-editor of Journal of Foreign Languages and Cultures. The purpose of this IPPH program is to highlight the work of another cultural icon. So let me begin by asking each member of the quartet to share or play a personal story about how they met A.B. Spellman and what they feel is his major contribution to jazz and jazz writing. And I ask people in the following order: Maurice first, then Holly second, Jenkins, and then Hill. So Maurice, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, and thank you, Mayor Pratt, for having us in Ethelbert here. Well, I first met A.B. Spellman through his book. I can remember the exact time I met him. I had gone off to Fisk University, and I didn't fit in except for the pool hall on Church Street. I was from the projects of Newport News. I dug jazz. I had a jazz playing stepfather who was a tenor man in an old Army Air Force band who had played with Dinah Washington, some of the greats. I was on financial aid, but I had a job at the International Student Center at night, and they had great books there. And I left my school books behind. They had the books of Fanon, of Du Bois, of Marx, of Rosa Luxemburg, of Ida B. Wells, of Fidel, of Mao. And I left the school books there, and I saw 3 books outside of those books I mentioned on the shelf. 3 jazz books, only 3. And they were Mingus's Beneath the Underdog, they were Baraka's Blues People, and they were A.B. Spellman's 4 Lives. And each one had a particular interest for me. Mingus, because he told such great tales, such fabulous tales about his adventures in Mexico and all this. Baraka, because he went to the origins of African-American music, the Negro spirituals. And at Fisk, I was there at the time when black folks, at least the black folks there, claimed they didn't want to be associated with the spirituals. They were music of slavery. They wanted to be disassociated. And I'd go at night and I'd listen to the Fisk Jubilee singers right there in the orchestra. Then one night, Alice Coltrane came, and she came with Rashid Ali and Garrison on bass. And then a couple of weeks later, Monk came. And Monk came, and hardly anybody was in the audience. And this is one of the few events that Robin Kelly wrote about, missed in his great book on Monk. But as I remember that Washington D.C.'s own Charlie Rouse was there, and so those 2 books had a great influence. But then I saw A.B. Spellman's book, and it had a singular purpose for me, and that was helping me to understand and appreciate the man who I really adored in music, Ornette Coleman, and to understand him and to dig on it. And but AB also taught me something else that I still keep today, that in order to understand anything, any music, anything that anybody writes or plays, you must first understand that individual, what makes them. In the words of the great German philosopher, it's not the consciousness of men and women who determine their conditions, it's the conditions of life that determine their consciousness. And AB went into this one by one with Ornette, with Cecil Taylor, with Herbie Nichols and Jackie McLean, talking about the things that formed their lives, formed them. And in Willis' edited books, he quotes Robin Kelly said something unique about this. The 4 Lives is perhaps the most honest account of the jazz world from the perspective of working people, of working men and women and artists. He asked the critical questions, not just about how the music came about, but how it survives and how one derives their inspiration from the communities. And AB did this by showing the work of where these individuals came from. He pointed out in his own words that Ornette's main contribution was rhythmic, Coltrane's was harmonic, and Taylor's was the construction and organization of the sound. He gives meaning to what the artists say themselves. Ornette may not be completely right when he says this, but he's getting into it. I think that Black people, and this is quoted in the book, I think that Black people in America have a superior sense when it comes to expressing their own convictions through music. Most white tend to think it beneath their dignity to just show their suffering and just how show any other meaning has to do with that. And in this book, AB shows the sufferings of African American people, how they've expressed those, the expressions of freedom through their music, through these people. Lastly, AB takes the approach of participatory, and he goes into the clubs. Just as Du Bois went into the neighborhoods in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Negro, just as Ingalls went into the working in the factories in the development of the working class in Russia, just as Elliot LeBeau in Manchester, who in our own books in DC went to Tally's Corner, went to the neighborhoods, AB went into the bars, the clubs, the communities to understand this. And he went to understand the social origins. Lastly, I will quote just a small, and I'm not a poetry reader, a small section from what AB wrote about the Luddites. And I did this because this week in class, we were discussing Luddites and anarcho-syndicalist people who tore up machines. And he says this: I want to live in a music whose melody is liable for the state of my soul. And
You muted yourself. Okay, you muted yourself at the end, Maurice. So I missed the benediction there. If you want to repeat what you closing?
No, I just quoted a few words from AB's poem, "The Luddite." And
Okay.
as I was saying, the Luddite people with machineries, and these I was teaching a course about England in the 18th century and the Luddites, and in America the anarcho-syndicalists who tore up machines when they couldn't control them. And he
Right.
says this in his poem: I want to live in a music whose melody is liable for the state of my soul. And AB has done that. He's brought this book, this music, to help our souls. Thank you, AB.
Okay. Thank you, Maurice. I thought the machine has muted you. You know how these machines have a tendency of fighting us.
I thought it was.
Thank you. Gene Holly, with Eugene Holly is next.
Well, thank you, Ethelbert, for having me. And thank you, everyone, for being here. This is a grand occasion. And I encountered Mr. Spellman in 3 spheres. The first sphere was through Bill Brower, who was my co-worker at Olson's Record and Tape. And it was through Bill that my jazz mind opened. I was 23 years old, and he played Kind of Blue, Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage, and Ahmad Jamad's But Not For Me Live at the Pershing. And it was through Bill Brower that I was beginning to, study all the music. And at one point, I said, well, I've been reading all the liner notes. I've been reading all the magazines. What should I read as far as books? This is around 1984. Bill said, first thing you got to read is, in my time, it was published as 4 Lives in the Bebop Business. And he said, it's by a man I know very well named A.B. Spellman. And I read the book, and it was like a revelation. It's like a lightning bolt went off in my brain. Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, Jackie McLean I heard of. I didn't hear about Herbie Nichols. But I read that when my mind was completely open about this music. And it set such a template for me as how to write about music, how to write about jazz, how to write about Black people. What Mr. Spellman showed me was how to take 4 complex individuals and show the unity of their diversity through their multivariate approaches to jazz. I learned a lot about these people, and the way that Mr. Spellman wrote about it was in a way that was very functional, but very broad. You usually don't find a writer who can be both, who can write for the common man with uncommon themes. And he personalized the plights of these musicians for me. And in doing so, gave me a very broad history of the musical and social environment that these people lived through. It was a revelation for me. It made me want to study their music more. It made me commit myself to the jazz cause even more. So, and so I'm reading this book, and then one day, Mr. Spellman comes to the store, and I didn't realize then that him and Bill were actually friends. And he would say, and I'm paraphrasing, okay, Bill, what should I buy today? And the real education for me was listening to these two gentlemen talk about music while I'm supposed to be working, you know? And it was it just stuff, a lot of stuff was over my head. They would talk about music. They would delve into politics and culture. I heard that for years. And finally, well, not finally, then I met Mr. Spellman when I was volunteering for the Capital City Jazz Festival. We would have meetings over his house on Monroe Street. And again, the education for me was the banter going back and forth between Mrs. Spellman and Bill and AB and a mutual friend of ours named Gail Dixon. I was just a sponge and I just learned so much about the culture. The final thing for me, at this time, I was also working at National Public Radio. I was filing my own pieces for Morning Edition. This was went up to 1988 now. So at that time, Grover Washington Jr. comes out with a new record called Then and Now. It was his straight ahead record to prove that he could play mainstream jazz, like people really needed that. So my boss at the time, the late Thurston Briscoe, told me that I needed a critic to talk about Grover Washington. And I said, I know just a person. And with much trepidation, I called Mr. Spellman to ask him if he could be the critic in my 7-minute piece for Morning Edition. He said yes. And piece ran in 1988. And I was just in heaven, man. So that's how AB was in my life in those three spheres. And he continues to be a pioneering influence in my life. And I would dare say in the life of anybody that wants to investigate this music.
Okay, thank you, Gene, taking us to heaven and back. Now we'll hear from Willie Jenkins. Unmute yourself.
I first met A.B. Spellman in about 1985. And it's when I was working in arts administration, specifically developing the only regional jazz arts services program at an organization called Arts Midwest in Minneapolis. And I met AB because I had traveled to Washington to sit on my first of many National Endowment for the Arts panels. So at those panels, even those executives and those directors at the endowment whose programs were not directly affected by those particular panel discussions, when it came time for the policy discussions, other directors would come to those meetings to observe. And A.B. Spellman is someone who came to those meetings, and I was introduced to him after I had actually read 4 Lives, and here it is, 4 Lives in the Bebop Business. And I was struck by his very positive demeanor, particularly where it concerned jazz music. And we were in a panel discussion where there were a lot of arguments during the policy procedure, during the policy discussion, a lot of arguments about why and how jazz needed more support from the National Endowment for the Arts. And that was one thing that compelled A.B. Spellman to be at that particular policy discussion, because at the endowment, he was all about the development of further support for jazz music. In fact, AB, I look at AB as one of the founders of the National Endowment for the Arts Jazz Masters Program. And, in fact, there now is actually an A.B. Spellman Award for jazz advocacy as part of the National Endowment for the Arts NEA Jazz Masters Program. And as far as the book, 4 Lives in the Bebop Business, what struck me about the book was the quality of the dialogue. And clearly, at a certain point, it came to me that the quality of the dialogue had something to do with the fact that these 4 musicians were discussing their careers and their pursuits with a so-called, what I refer to as a fellow traveler, because these were musicians who had been plying their craft for many years, but had rarely, if ever, encountered a Black jazz critic or Black jazz author. And so I think that certainly helped to enrich the dialogue in Four Lives in the Bebop Business, because these musicians were conveying their lives to someone they knew could relate to the communities they came from and how they came up. And so that further enriched the dialogue. Now, you know, the four lives in the book, the four interviewees in the book, three of them are subsequently became National Endowment for the Arts Jazz Masters, and that would be Cecil Taylor, Ornette Coleman, and Jackie McLean. The one that really fascinated me was the more obscure of the four, and that would be Herbie Nichols. And since that time, it's become clear that Herbie Nichols left a powerful legacy, because when I approached this book, Ain't But a Few of Us, which A.B. Spellman and Eugene Holly are both contributors to, A.B. Spellman was the first interview that I conducted for that book. And it took 10 years to put together what eventually became the book. And it started as an online series. And people like Eugene Holly were actually the ones who encouraged me to put these interviews together in a book. And so A.B. Spellman became the first person that was interviewed for the book. And for that, I'm eternally grateful to A.B. Spellman.
Thank you, Willie. Bobby Hill.
Pleasure to be here with all you guys. It really is an honor. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. I'll start off by saying I was born in 1959 in Washington, D.C. I'm a native of Washington, D.C., born in the Southeast. Thank you, thank you. And I think that was the same year that Four Lives was first published in 1959.
66.
66. What happened in 59? I'm remembering that date as well. I don't know why. But 66, I was still very, very young. So when I started getting into jazz and looking at sources that could expand my knowledge of jazz and appreciation of jazz, there were a number of books I went after. One was Leroy Jenkins' Blues People. And one, of course, was this book by A.B. Spellman, Four Lives in the Bebop Business. Reread the introduction over the past couple of days, powerful introduction. Reread the first chapter on Cecil Taylor, because I'm most impressed by Cecil Taylor as a musician. He's in the world of music that I enjoy. And it's really a joy to read the book again and hear it told from the standpoint of the musicians completely. It was wonderful to hear so many words of Cecil Taylor that were his words. They weren't the words of A.B. talking about Cecil Taylor, though there was some of that too, done very well. But it was Cecil's words. And then you got to hear Buell Nightingale's words, a performer with Cecil Taylor talk about Cecil Taylor. So it was so nice to hear the words being shared by the artists themselves and less by people talking about the artist, though A.B. does that very, very well. But it was done in a way that really worked for me. The first time I saw A.B., I can't recall. A.B. is like a man of D.C. as well, and I'm a man following the music in D.C. It could have been at D.C. Space. It could have been at a performance at the Smithsonian. Could have been anything like that. But always impressed by the things that he does, and appreciate being here today to celebrate A.B.'s work with you guys.
Okay, thank you, Bobby. I'm going to ask about maybe 2-3 questions.
Sure.
In Jenkins' book, we find what I think is a very interesting statement by A.B. Spellman. And A.B. writes, I stopped writing about jazz because I was frustrated by my limitations. I didn't know enough music to do the kind of technical analysis I thought was needed. So my question to the quartet is, what do you feel might be your own limitation when it comes to jazz writing and understanding the music?
Well, I have to jump in on that because I come from a similar perspective. I'm not a musician, nor in my writing about the music have I ever leaned on what I refer to as the science of music. And I think that a number of our fellow journalists and critics have leaned too heavily on what I refer to as the science of music, in some cases as a means of trying to impress their fellow writers and as a means of trying to impress the readers with their knowledge of music. But when I speak with the average reader of those journals and of those books, that's not what they're seeking. They're seeking a sense of the feeling of the music and what the music might express to them and how it expressed that to the writer, as opposed to a lot of technical jargon. I don't think technical jargon in jazz writing particularly serves the music very well. And so AB is one writer who doesn't necessarily lean on that. And it was interesting to read what you just talked about, Ethelbert, because I know I have read that passage many times myself. And I've read it because, I felt like this was someone who understood where I was coming from in my writing. And I felt like reaching out to AB and saying, hey, don't worry about that aspect of it, because the way you express the music speaks to the common man and woman and common reader about this music. And, in addition to the interview with AB and the chapter on AB in the book, Ain't But a Few of Us, we also have an anthology section. And I had to make sure to include something by A.B. Spellman in the anthology section, because in interviewing many of the writers who contributed, most of the writers, in fact, who contributed to Ain't But a Few of Us, when I asked them what writers might have inspired their pursuit as writers, the two writers that practically everyone cited as being an inspiration were A.B. Spellman and Leroy Jones, also known as Amiri Baraka. And so these two gentlemen were actually Howard University buddies on the yard and whatnot. And so they have the two of them have great history. And to have people respond that those were the two writers that inspired them and inspired their pursuit of writing about jazz, I think is important. And I think that AB needn't worry about that aspect of the technical jargon of music, because I don't think that's what the average reader is interested in reading.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? Well, let me ask a question to Bobby, because I know you like the type of music that, sometimes we don't hear on the radio. And it seems that requires a certain sort of knowledge. And I wonder, how did you sort of navigate that type of music?
Well, I was exposed to it, luckily, because the PFW had some wonderful programmers when they first kicked on the air. Back in the day, PFW was pretty much not all strict. Had a good deal of free jazz and straight ahead jazz. And there were few jazz stations like that. So there were many sources to find on PFW that shared their music. So that's when I first found out about it and was exposed to it and fell in love with it. But what moves me, there's a quote by John Cage. Everybody knows who John Cage is. And that guides my appreciation in following the music. It says, the wisest thing to do is open one's ears immediately and hear sound suddenly, before one's thinking has a chance to turn it into something symbolical, illogical, or abstract. And that's kind of how I've approached hearing these new sounds. Just open one's ears immediately and hear sound before you get too critical or analyze it too deeply. Just hear the sound and see what the sound itself does to you. And the sound may move you before you realize you're listening to something that's really weird and crazy.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me move into a question that I think Mayor Pratt might want us to talk about. We often talk about jazz, and then we talk about New Orleans, we talk about Kansas City, we talk about New York. What are a few of the key things people should know about jazz in DC? And we can talk about the past as well as what's going on now. And I'll begin with you, Maurice, because you've done a lot of historical work on jazz history in DC. I'm just unmute.
As I was reading over, I also read the book, and I read. I wanted to mention this to AB that I know he. And I'm not making a comparison, but I know he said in the book he tried to reach Coltrane, and Coltrane said he couldn't do the interview. And we did the DC jazz book. We tried to get AB, but he was just tied up with other things. So things do happen. You know, DC has a long history of the jazz because it has a long history of African Americans, and most came from the South. James Reese Europe came from Mobile, Alabama. He's the most proficient. He lived next door to down the street from John Philip Sousa. And this music spread. Of course, we know of the role of Duke Ellington. But before we get to Duke Ellington, let's get to Frederick Douglass, who learned the violin and whose grandson, learned the violin, classical violin, and then went off to Europe to play it. William Marion Cook, who was a teacher of Ellington, all these classicists. So we have all of this. We had just this long line of people. One problem is Ben Ethelbert that you know, in those days, to be known, you had to leave Washington D.C. So you had to leave, and so all the greats left. James Reese left. Others left. Eckstein was here. He left. Many others. People like Ruth Brown and Buck Hill decided to stay to raise their families, but it was very difficult. DC, you know, I came in the 70s. It was still a little southern town. It was. I just wanted to get to New York, but then, you know, I didn't. I stayed. I got active. I, you know, got married and things like that. And then DC, of course, you know, changed. And Bobby, you know, with the with this the Free Jazz Institute on 7th Street and places like that. So it sort of opened up. DC has always been a place that had those, and now you see musicians coming back. That is so interesting. You see bass players like Cochran Holt coming back. You see others coming back and making their mark on music. One problem is that with the gentrification of the city, we're losing so much of the Black population, and therefore we're losing the clubs. And as I was expressing to Mayor Pratt, it would be my hope that the city would take a greater role in helping to open up Bohemian cabins, stuff like that. If they can open up some of the places they're opening up, they can make room for the Atlas and the big places down in Southwest. They can do more to help open up, you know, these institutions in Washington and give small business loans and things like that to people in order to survive.
Gene, I know you're in exile in Delaware, but comment about, you know, DC in terms of jazz history.
Well, you know, as I was saying before, everything in DC jazz begins with Duke Ellington. He's the alpha and omega of the jazz in the city. When I lived in DC, the years I was there, there's a certain kind of, every city has a certain cultural resonance. Musicians from Newark sound a certain way on their horns. Musicians from Baltimore have a vibe. The vibe of the DC jazz musician is simultaneously up south and down home. You know, when I hear people like Buck Hill, he had that kind of vibe. You know, Shirley Horn, not only singing but playing piano, had that, you know, that kind of urban down home kind of thing going on. And so did the great Charlie Rouse, you know. So I always heard that in the Washington area politicians. We were talking about Mr. Reuben Brown, who I used to hear at One Step Down all the time. So a lot of musicians that established the DC sound, they would leave, you know. And that's one of the things about DC. It's kind of unfortunate. The musicians that do go on to prominence, they go on somewhere else, you know. You've got some great musicians like Ben Williams, who still has a presence here. Michael Bowie is still in the area. A lot of people I can name, but there's always that, you know, I mean, DC is a southern city, but it's also a cosmopolitan city. And again, Duke Ellington encompassed all of that. So everybody has a little bit of that in here.
I'll go to Bobby and then Willard. Bobby, you've been involved in terms of producing jazz in the city. Talk about your take of what's happening here, or has been happening here.
Well, honored to have been at Bohemian Caverns for about a decade presenting jazz, pretty much until they closed, free jazz, and that was a wonderful thing. Amar Brown, who was the manager of the space, just opened it up to the music. We did a thing called Sundays at 7 at the Cavern. It was a Sunday 7 o'clock concert. We did that for, like I said, for I guess about 6 or 7, 8 years until the space closed. And we had good people come out to hear good music. Um, Going back to Duke Ellington again, I mentioned I was from DC. I grew up, one of the first places we lived was 11th and T Street. And Duke Ellington, we understood, lived only a few, I didn't know him, but I understood he grew up and was living a few blocks away from that. So DC is a city for this music in a big way. I'm sorry, lost my
Mhm.
thought.
Okay, well, we'll have, this is why I call you guys a quartet. So now what happens,
Thank you, sir.
I have Jenkins here, and so he can, he's on piano now, so you can play little brief keys to help Bobby out. So you talk about, unmute yourself, Willard, and then we're gonna move from the music to poetry. But comment about the city and jazz.
Well, I first off, I have to applaud Maurice Jackson and Blair Rubel for putting together the DC Jazz book.
Yes, yes.
That was an important contribution to the literature, an important contribution to the history of this music called jazz here in Washington, D.C. Now, I'm someone, I just got here as a resident in 1989, but I have been forever impressed with the quality of the jazz scene here. Like Maurice, I'm someone who, as a young man, chased the dream of living in New York, but I wound up here through serendipity, wound up here to take a job through serendipity, and found this to be a very welcoming place for someone with my passion for jazz. Because when I first got here, there was not one, but there were actually two stations that specialized in jazz when I got here. And I've been on WPFW now for 34 years playing jazz. In fact, I've got to leave here in about an hour to do my program. But I'm forever impressed with the quality of not only the scene here in DC, but the musicians. And I think we have to give a nod to the Duke Ellington School of the Arts and to Howard University's jazz program, because musicians that came through those two programs are the beating heart of the jazz musician community here in Washington, D.C. And we have some wonderful musicians right here in D.C.
Okay, and we have a wonderful person who's going to talk about A.B. Spellman as a poet. So, Lori Shai, I turn to you, and you can talk about A.B. the poet, and then that'll lead into A.B. sharing some poems from his career. Unmute, Lori.
Thank you, Mayor Pratt. Thank you, Ethelbert. I just want to sit and listen to music with all of you. What an amazing first half of the program. Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. 2024 marks the release of a major new book by A.B. Spellman from Wesleyan University Press titled Between the Night and Its Music, New and Selected Poems. New and selected means brand new poems that have never been published, and a selection of poems from across his entire career, including poems from his 1965 book, The Beautiful Days, and his 2008 book, Things I Must Have Known, as well as poems that have previously been uncollected, appeared only in magazines, or are long out of print. In other words, this book is a jewel, a representative record of A.B. Spellman's poems from the 1950s to 2023. I had to cut him off or he would still be tinkering, but there will be a next book and a next book, I am sure. This full-length poetry collection is an important milestone for several reasons. Wesleyan University Press has a long and illustrious legacy of publishing only the most renowned and influential poets, and is widely regarded as one of the finest publishers of modern poetry, if not the best. Their list is an absolute who's who of our greatest poets, both nationally and internationally. So the support of this press is public affirmation of the stature of A.B. Spellman as one of our most important poets. As I mentioned, this book provides a cross-section of Spellman's entire poetic career, going all the way back to the 1950s. Very few poets have been able to sustain a career of such long duration, and even fewer poets have continued to so spectacularly grow and evolve over time. As you'll see from this book and the sample of poems that A.B. will be reading, he's created a body of poetry that is spoken in a strong and distinctive voice from his youth. The earliest poems stand up remarkably well, and many of them feel as fresh and relevant as they did when they were created. But like our greatest artists, his most recent poems are among his most brilliant. They truly reveal the polish and mastery he has gained over half a century of reverence, love, and dedication to this medium. The book is also a significant landmark as an essential volume both for readers who are already familiar with Spellman's poetry and to attract new readers. It will surely be used as a teaching text in university classrooms and will also have wide appeal to general readers. So I think this book will firmly and once and for all confirm A.B. Spellman's status as an essential and canonical poet in the English language. One of our themes for today's program, of course, is music and specifically jazz. And I think that we can see Spellman's writing is not neatly divided into separate categories, but flows between these fields. Although he thinks of himself mainly as a poet, and as you've heard, he's humble about his knowledge of music. He's obviously a brilliant writer on jazz, but it's impossible to imagine A.B. Spellman's poetry without the presence of music and musicality. He has a keen awareness of sound, of rhythm, of mellifluousness, of dissonance, of the cross-cutting and interweaving of sonic and semantic themes. As we read and listen, we discover lots of repeated words and phrases, onomatopoeia, alliteration, rhythmic shifts juxtaposed with rapid shifts in narrative direction, themes that travel, transmute, and return. Many of his poems are dedicated to or inspired by musicians from many different styles and genres, but his poems are also infused with a sensitive awareness of the other arts, as we see from numerous poems dedicated to or inspired by artists, again from different periods, nationalities, and styles. Spellman is a brilliant crafter of imagery. Our senses and minds are continuously being taken to places we never expected at a fever pitch of sensitive awareness. These are some of the technical reasons that many of his best poems sound like more than language, more than purely literary or textual artifacts. They also feel like an ensemble of sensory instruments. Our very beings are engaged. Yet these are also deeply thinking poems. We go all the way back to metaphysical poets like John Donne, who developed his ideas and understandings of the meaning of life by working through the process of writing his poems, or as with Shakespeare's propositional sonnets, or the wit of Alexander Pope, or Emily Dickinson's pithy lyrical arguments, or the ingenious double voicing of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Spellman's poems are not merely imagistic or sensory, although they are that too. These are very much a thinking man's poems. The most enlightening and entertaining thing I could do is to read A.B. Spellman's poems to you, but he does it better than I do, and you'll get to hear him soon anyway. So I'm going to do the next best thing, which is really to offer my tribute to a writer who I regard as a brilliant and classic poet. Not a jazz poet, not a Black poet, not even an American poet, but a poetic artist in the English language whose work I sincerely believe will remain a lasting and meaningful part of the canon that stands the test of time, and I'll explain why. Spellman's very earliest poetry gained him such an important reputation that it's anthologized and quoted to this day. If we look at the Beautiful Days, we can see it's actually a very slim chapbook, but this spare volume contains poems that we see in the most prominent contemporary literature anthologies. As we know, A.B. Spellman performed quite an extraordinary act by choosing to serve the public by fundamentally transforming National Endowment for the Arts through the proposition that public funding for arts and culture should serve a full and diverse range of the public. This model, which was initially resisted as quite radical, has subsequently become the national and even the international norm. By devoting his knowledge and experience as a poet to this cause, there was a mistaken impression that the soul of the poet remained in Spellman's youthful era only. It wasn't a totally wrong idea. Spellman really did put his poetry on hold, but on retiring from the NEA, he retrieved the earlier path and built up his chops once again. His former image as a poet of the 1960s and the Black Arts movement was partially corrected when he returned full force to poetry with his full-length 2008 book of poems, Things I Must Have Known, which received significant attention and acclaim. But ideas can be resistant and hard to change. In the 15 years since his second book was published, Spellman has continued writing with a spirit and a skill that I believe is now at an extraordinary pinnacle of achievement. We might look at his career in three segments to date: the early work of The Beautiful Days, the middle period of Things I Must Have Known, written 40 years later, and now what I see as the full flowering of one of our most gifted living poets in his momentous forthcoming book. Here's what I look for in great and lasting poetry, and I want yes to answers to every question. I ask myself, is a prose paraphrase impossible? Am I riveted to the delightful ingenuity of every word as essential to the poem's meaning and wholeness, but also totally surprising? Do I feel a voice of perceptiveness and insight, even wisdom, that can teach me something valuable to carry away? Do the poems keep calling me to reread them? Do they enliven my mind, my senses, and my very sense of being? Do the poems feel alive, and do they bring me to life? Do I feel they've irrevocably changed me and become part of me? Are they crafted but not casual, meticulously contrived, technically deliberate, but not false or stuffy or exercises? And A.B. Spellman's poems for me are a yes on every point. What makes an A.B. Spellman poem? From the time of early poems like John Coltrane and Impartial Review to his magnificent new Van Gogh series, the poems are not commenting on themselves, they're commenting on the subject of the poem, very similarly to the way his jazz writing has been described today. Spellman's poems are never unilinear. They contain multiple interwoven themes, which include juxtapositions of diction, which it takes enormous mastery to handle. Otherwise, poems wind up sounding like a jumble of conflicting registers and directions. Stylistically, his poetry is audacious. The same words repeat in different grammatical categories and with shocking accruals of fresh meanings, often engineered by stunningly brilliant line breaks. We start off someplace where we think we know where we are, and by the end of the poem, we're shocked and even a little disoriented to see where the poet has craftily taken us and where we've wound up. I typically read Spellman poems in a circular way. At the end, you really need to go back to the beginning multiple times to figure out what the journey was. We almost need to map it out to see the sheer delight and ingeniousness of how stanzas logically follow previous stanzas, and yet those Spellman twists and turns constantly take us in new directions. With a Spellman poem, the poet demonstrates that no topic worth contemplating is simple. There are always multiple avenues of entrance and exit and detours within. Contemplation leads us to another characteristic feature of Spellman's poems. These are lyric poems about ideas, people, art, life, pain, loss, love, all those big abstractions that are basically what we all care about the most. They are Baroque, metaphysical, and completely of the moment. With A.B. Spellman, we're looking at a body of poetry that spans more than half a century, from before the civil rights era to nearly the end of the first quarter of the new millennium. It's a treasure to have such a major body of writing by any author. A.B. Spellman reveals poetry's ability to serve as a cultural and historical record and an aesthetic object of lasting beauty that transcends boundaries of time and space. So now it's our great joy and pleasure and privilege and honor to listen to the poems of the great and greatly loved A.B. Spellman. It's all you, A.B.
Okay, and you may have to unmute. Unmute. Okay, there
I
we
believe
go.
I'm alive now.
Right?
I don't know what to say after this, all this praise from Laurie and from all these wonderful jazz writers whose work I learn from every day. I want to first of all express my gratitude to you, Ethelbert. You are doing a wonderful thing for me with this program. I am glad these are the kind of words people have spoken over them after they die. And I'm glad that you got them to me while I still have a year or so left. At 87, my thoughts often go to legacy. And I hope that my legacy will stand as everyone has spoken so well of it. I am humbled and I am proud. And I can think of no better way to be. I also want to thank Mayor Pratt Kelly for having this event and heading this institute. DC's story needs to be told because it is often described as a city of politicians, and it is not at all that. It is a city of very, very alive, very living, and very creative people. I'm going to read, first of all, a poem I hadn't planned to read, but since the Institute is about DC, I'm going to read half of a poem called The City Poet on the Stroll. It's for Gaston Neal, who I'm sure everybody up there, except Laurie may not have met him, but everybody who's in DC would know Gaston very well. Gaston was a stand-up poet and a very good one and a very active person in DC life. I should give a few of my glosses here because there are names that people may not recognize. I mentioned Jelly Roll Morton, who lived in DC for a while, Duke Ellington, who was from DC. I mentioned Cab as Cab Calloway. I mentioned the Howard Theater. And at the Howard, I mentioned Peg Leg Bates, who was a one-legged tap dancer. And if you think that's funny, you don't know Peg Leg because he could really go. And well, I'll stop all that. I'm going to read half the poem. And here it is. The City Poet on the Stroll for Gaston Neal. My fast walking buddy slowed down. For forever he spun round corners, his hustle in his bag, his habits in overdrive, too quick for the breeze, too slick for the roller. 14th and U changed colors in the streaking seasons before and after us. Jelly Roll, hustler to the bone, the lordly Duke, swooped through here, derbied and spatted, wolfing on soft-hatted women, all fine in their honeyed aspect. Walls of his heart, cool blow that whips the flame, the corners dancing gravitons pull the brown swells home. My buddy's home spot in Pittsburgh, the Crawford Grill, housed bebop liberated hip boys, swung out of cabs' neat seats with wheat pleats into yardbirds redefined tweeds and shades. My hip-talking buddy told stories of the Pittsburgh Hill, Murphy men playing on the respectable greedy, knife fights in the pool room that didn't even stop the games. My buddy danced him to life for White, the mad painter, and me. In our new day, 56, 57, 9th and U, 14th and U, sweet and sour Georgia Avenue, were as swinging as DC owned. Some flicks in this block, Latin dance in that loft, hard bop in this basement, brown bags in that cabaret, fast domino and peg leg bass at the Howard. I knew the facades and parlors, My quick stepping buddy knew the back rooms and alleys. Upstairs at A-Bart's, Buck and Gus and Stump let me sing on the last set to a near empty room. I like to think because the squares had split and they thought the crowd down enough, but in truth, they were tired. So here, AB, have the mic. Angel Eyes in C. I wanted a cool like Johnny Hartman's. My next buddy didn't care. He wanted to rap about the Malamé in my back pocket. I knew books, but craved the corners city poets from Baudelaire to Langston had told me of. He knew the streets, but craved the books he had no guide for. He said, so go there with me. I know hard nuance that will decorate the rills of your brain with glow and shadow. Rooms of this limp city where men still jam the Delta blues in time to the rim shot percussion of dice against the baseboard. No back doors to alleys where the trade is in the pleasures of the edge of the skin. The census order rules. You learn to see as the blind see, with the light of knowing what the books don't teach, with the omniscient eye of living when the power wants you dead. Yes, I said, come here with me. I know verse that will not leave you even as the years abbreviate memory. Lines to make a family of. Show you that thought you almost had when the gray sickness enclosed you and the scream wouldn't sound. How like the streets the broken line pages, you read it down below your reason, down beneath the bottom, where mad lost truth cringes and hides. All right. I won't read the second half of the poem. It goes into Gaston was a drug addict for many years. He died sober, but I just didn't particularly feel like talking about that aspect of his life tonight. All right, Bert. I'm going to do a poem that you included in an anthology of yours called "The Twist." It was from the Beautiful Days. A dancer's world is walls, movement confined. Music, God's last breath. Rhythm, the last beating of his heart. A dancer follows that sound, blind to its source, toward walls with others. She cannot dance alone. She thinks of thought as windows, as ice around the dance. Can you break it? Move.
Yeah.
A poem from the Black Arts years, from 1968, I believe. The names that I mentioned in here are mostly SNCC workers. I mentioned Cheney, Swerner, and Goodman, two of which were co-workers, and one was a SNCC worker who were murdered and their bodies flung into the Mississippi. I mentioned Walter Cronkite. He, of course, was the anchor on CBS News. I should point this out. I mentioned South Carolina. I talk about a demonstration that was held at Voorhees State, which and after the demonstration went over, state troopers came to the campus and shot up and murdered about 3 or 4 students at the time when they were doing nothing but standing still on their own campus. Okay. When Black people are with each other, we sometimes whisper over. I'll start again. When Black people are with each other, we sometimes fear ourselves, whisper over our shoulders about unmentionable acts, and sometimes we fight and lie. These are some things we sometimes do. And when alone, I sometimes walk from wall to wall, fighting visions of white men fighting me, and Black men fighting white men and fighting me. And I lose myself between walls and ricocheting shots, and can't say for certain who I have killed or been killed by. It is the fear of winter passing and summer coming, and the killing I have called for coming to my door saying, hit it, AB, you're in it too. And the white army moves like thieves in the night, mass producing beautiful black horses and then stealing them away, while my frequent death watches me from Orangeburg on Cronkite, and I'm oiling my gun and cooking my food and saying, when the time comes, to myself, over and over, hopefully. But I remember driving from Atlanta to Birmingham with Stone and Featherstone and Cleve, and Feather talked about dueling a pair of Klansmen, and Cleve told how they hunted Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman's bodies in the haunted hours of the silver nights in the Mississippi swamp, while a runaway survivor from Orangeburg slept between wars on the back seat. Times like this are times when Black people are with each other, and the strength flows back and forth between us like borrowed breath.
Very nice, very nice.
All right. From things I must have known, I have a poem called After Vallejo, after the Afro-Peruvian surrealist poet Cesar Vallejo, who died, I think, about 1929. And that's kind of stolen image from a poem of his. And so I acknowledge that in the title. After Vallejo, I will die in Havana in a hurricane. It will be morning. I'll be facing southwest, away from the Gulf, away from the storm, away from home, looking to the virid hills of Matanzas where the Orisha rise, lifted by congueros in masks of iron, bongoceros in masks of water, timbaleros in masks of fire, by all the clave that binds the rhythms of this world. I'll be writing when I go, revising another hopeful survey of my life. I will die of nothing that I did, but of all that I did not do. I promised myself a better self than I could make, and I will not forgive. You will be there, complaining that I never saved you, that I left you where you live, stranded in your own green dream. When you come for me, come singing, no dirge, but scat my eulogy and bebop code. Sing that I died among gods, but lived with no God and did not suffer for it. Find one true poem that I made and sing it to my shade as it fades into the wind. Sing it presto in 4/4 time in the universal ghetto key of B flat. I will die in Havana in rhythm. Tumbayo, Montuno, Guaguanco, dense strata of rhythm pulsing me away. And the mother of waters will say to the saint of crossroads, well, damn, he danced his way out after all.
Yeah.
Do I have time for another, Ethelbert?
Yeah, one more.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I'll for a little humor. And this is a poem that will be in the next collection, which has not appeared in any other collection. It's called The Women I Have Not Slept With. And I've dedicated to all my friends who write tell-all memoirs, which is a tendency I cannot find any justification for. I never understand it. All right. The women I have not slept with. They number in the billions, and that's if I only count the living. For example, I have not slept with Sarah Palin, and not because she shoots large mammals for fun. I have not slept with her because she's too far right and I'm too far left, and that's too much miscegenation to arouse. Nor have I had sex with Hillary Clinton. Though I did have a shot at Hillary, and I have a photograph to prove it. That's me shaking hands with her, head cocked to the side, a mating signal in every primate male. And I think I saw something in the curl of her mouth, but I couldn't make my move there in the gold room with the lion pushing at my back. But we'll see, we'll see. I have not slept with Madonna. Before you get the impression that I've only not slept with white women, I haven't slept with Oprah either. No fault of hers, no fault of mine, we just never hooked up. Never made it with Vanessa Williams, and that one hurts. She once split from a sexual fantasy of mine, took one look at my admittedly adipose body and disappeared from my fantasy and wouldn't come back. Broke my tumescent heart. And then there's Shaka Khan, sweet, sweet, sweet Shaka, the lust of my life. I did get to hug her once, a nice belly to belly rub, but my boss was in the room and nothing came of it. She sent me a box of chocolates. And so it goes or it doesn't. If I haven't slept with you and haven't mentioned you, please don't be offended. I thought that you deserved your own poem.
Hey, B, I want to thank you for practicing safe sex.
Very nice.
There
Very
is, brother.
That brings us to the end of our program, and it's filled with a lot of love and not just love, but also joy. So, Joy, Austin, would you want to say something?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm like everybody, I think, in this audience, I am mesmerized and so very, very happy to have shared these moments with A.B., reading these poems so eloquently. So we don't have too many questions, Ethelbert. In fact, we only have two. So one of them is a question for the first panel. And the question is, who is listening to jazz? And that's a question for the first panel. And then the second question, and I think Laurie may have talked about this a little bit, has to do with if A.B. could talk a little bit about how his very long, distinguished arts administration career, which Laurie also discussed, how did he keep his commitment to his poetry during that long spell of all of these achievements in arts administration? So two questions. The first one is, who is listening to jazz for the first panel?
Well, I think Willard should answer that question first, since he got a show at 11 o'clock today.
Okay.
Well, I would invite that person to come to the DC Jazz Festival Labor Day weekend at the Wharf. Come, enjoy yourself, and then ask me that question afterwards. I don't think you'd have that question afterwards if you saw the number of delighted people who come to that festival. And, one of the things about this music we call jazz is, I think the biggest disparity is in the audience and in our need to further develop and grow the audience for the music. But there is a robust audience for this music. If you're not seeing it, you're not going to the right place.
Mm-hmm. Bobby, you want to comment on that, and Gene and Maurice?
I would say, no, go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
Gene?
Go ahead, Eugene.
You're muted.
Mute. Unmute. Unmute, Gene. Gene, unmute.
Sorry about that. I wanted to say that there's no one jazz audience. There are jazz audiences. So to answer the question, everybody's listening to jazz, but there are so many subgroups. One of the most surprising audiences for jazz are people listening to hip hop, because lots of hip hop are sampled out of jazz recordings. A lot of them. Donald Byrd, Herbie Hancock, the late Ahmad Jamal has a lot of samples. I heard Ahmad Jamal's Swahili Land when De La Soul was performing on the Tonight Show 2 weeks ago. And a lot of these guys are going back to the original source to hear the music. So there's a lot of different audiences listening to the music.
Okay, thank you, Jean. Maurice? Unmute.
As I think about that, I think about all the musicians now who are reaching out to larger audiences. And I just looked at just a couple of CDs I've gotten recently. I've over the period of time. People like Kristen McBride, who's making records about civil rights. People like Nikki Giovanni, who has a beautiful album of Negro spirituals and poetry. People like Ron Miles. So many people, young people, who are making music that is still jazz, but that is addressing great social concerns. And I think that is the movement towards today. People who are making music that address the great questions of our time. In DC, as you know, if you live in DC, the Kennedy Center has a whole series on women in jazz, a number of women who are listening to jazz today. So I, agree with Willard, just go down and put pressure, if you're really interested, put pressure on your cities and others. The city should not be wasting this time talking about bringing a defunct football team back unless they show us that the whole culture is going to change. Do something to help open up some clubs so young people will have a place. And let me just say this, the jazz that I knew and that Willard knew and Bobby and others knew came out of, and Eugene knew came out of different periods. And often that jazz was the total music of our experiences and came out, and it had great influence on rhythm and blues and other things. I think you're exactly right. A lot of the young rappers and things I see now are sampling their music or listening to it. And I think it's a great future, but nothing has a future without support.
Bobby, did you want to end on a note on this first question?
The question was who is listening to it? Was that the question? It's hard to know who is listening to it, really is. But when we present what is the difficult music, avant-garde jazz, I'm seeing a lot newer people coming out to hear those sounds. So I will tell you that younger people, new people are open to that music. So glad of that. But we put it out there. We don't know who's listening to it.
Okay.
Willard does it through his presentations, through his jazz shows. We all do it. And it's difficult to know exactly who is hearing it, but we think people hear it.
Okay.
We hope people hear it.
Okay, thank you. Joy, can we hear that second question again, and then that moves into Lori and AB? Just unmute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are great answers, all very different. So lots of people are listening to jazz. That's wonderful. Okay, so the question has to do with AB's long distinguished career as an arts administrator. And how was he able to keep his commitment to poetry all of those years?
All right, thank you, Joy, and thanks for having me, Joy. You look wonderful. I haven't seen you in a long time. We go back a long ways together, and you were around for a lot of that career that you call distinguished so graciously. Well, the fact of the matter is that the Arts Endowment almost killed me as a poet. When I first came there, I ran smack dab into a rule that is a good rule in government, which is that you cannot benefit from grants that you make. Now, this meant that even though I wasn't personally involved in those particular grants, but I was no longer able to publish in the nonprofit press or give poetry readings at universities or anybody who was eligible to apply to the Arts Endowment. So which meant that I was cut off completely from an audience. So I stopped writing for a lot of years. I was at the endowment for about 30 years. And for the first 25 of those years, I did not write poetry. And then I tell this story often. Laurie's heard it many times. It occurred to me that if I were to die, my children would have to put on my tombstone, "Here lies Dad, he wrote great guidelines." And I thought, well, I can't have that. And I decided to try to reclaim my identity as a poet. Now, if you can imagine not playing the piano for 25 years and then sitting down to it and trying to blow, you find that you really couldn't do it. Your chops are gone and you have to get them back. So I started doing a lot of exercises that I used to put my students in workshops through. And I won't list those exercises, but it produced a lot of what is called doggerel in the profession. That is poems that don't make any sense and are just a bunch of words on the page pretending to be poems. But I didn't care about that. I was just trying to do specific things. I wrote sonnets to try to get a sense of rhythm back and to try to get a sense of form and try to get my ear back. I wrote responses to paintings at museums and galleries to try to get my eye back and other exercises like that until I finally got to where I thought I could make a poem again. So during my last 5 years at the endowment, I wrote a lot of poems. And those poems are available in the book that was mentioned, Things I Must Have Known. And since then, of course, that's what I have concentrated on most, on building a legacy as a poet. And I have, I think, it's actually my last several years have been the most productive years of my life as a poet. I'm far more prolific than I've ever been before. And I'm also liking these poems better than any poems I've written before, things that Laurie so graciously pointed out. I do want to give a word of praise to Laurie Shire. She has been a very, very great help to me in the last year. She placed the book at Wesleyan for me, which was a great thing for her to do. She has been so patient with me when I find a better word for a poem that I wrote that was published 20 years ago, and I find, no, this word will be better in that poem than the one that's down. I can't stop revising it, which she mentioned, but she puts up with all that, all with good humor, all with good grace, and all with great taste. And that's been, I can never thank her enough. I never can thank you people enough too. I really do. I love love, and then you've given me a lot of it tonight, and I'll live on that for a while.
Well, Avery, I want to ask you a question
Okay.
because you're talking about poetry, but you were very instrumental for the Free DC group. And I was wondering whether people like Sheila Kreider, Greg Tate, Janetta Barris, just being around them, that kept the poetry flame alive.
Oh, it did. It did. That was during the period when I just started writing again, and there were some good stories about that. That workshop, the Free DC Writers Workshop, that was in my basement here in the house I'm in now. And first it was just women poets there. And there are all these, this is like late 70s, late 80s feminism. And these were fire-breathing, they were writing these fire-breathing poems, feminist poems. And I'm being very careful not to deal with content, but only with shape and form and, straightening out lines and all that. And it was going well. They liked me, I liked them. And then Askia Muhammad walked in.
Mm.
And I had met Askia when he was in Boston and was editor of Muhammad Speaks. And I just met him and I saw him and he was innocent. I thought he was like this real, straight back Muslim conservative guy. And he walks into the room and I said, man, these women are not going to tolerate a relationship with this guy. This is never going to work. My workshop is dead. And then Askia broke out some poems and they were the most tender, gentle, sensitive poems. And they were very good poems and everything was very cool. Then of course, Greg Tate came in, Iron Man, with his young macho self, and that was a lot of fun too. So I got more out of the workshop than they did, I think.
Well, that's very important. I'm glad you mentioned that. Well, back to you, Joy.
So there are a lot of comments about how much people have enjoyed both sections of this program tonight. But there is one more question, if it's possible for AB to answer this one. They call it a modest question. You were writing, AB, in the late 1950s and were a potential inclusion in the New American Poetry. Any thoughts on why that didn't happen? Mary would have been the point of contact.
Yeah, no, Mary wasn't involved in the editing of the New American Poetry. That was
Donna Allen, I think. Donald Allen.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. Not Allen. And I knew him quite well. But actually, at that point, I really wasn't good enough to be in that book. I had just come to New York, and I had just run into. I had never been in a community of accomplished poets before. And then all of a sudden I was surrounded by all these people who had done all this fabulous work. And I had a lot of catching up to do. So at that point, I really wasn't good enough to be in that anthology. So I don't blame Don Allen for not including me at all. I think he would have a few years later. But at that point, no, I wasn't ready.
Well, that opens the door to another question, AP. What was your relationship to Diana DePrima? Because she published your first book.
Yeah, she was a friend, wonderful woman. I tried to see her again in San Francisco recently, but we couldn't get it together. Yeah, she was a friend and a very, very, very smart and wise Poundian poet. So that's something that's a part of moving into this community of poets, is you meet people who come from various schools of writing poetry. And Diane and Paul Blackburn, they were Poundians.
And how close were you to Frank O'Hara, who wrote the introduction?
I know him quite well. Knew him through Baraka. Frank was one of the major curators at the Museum of Modern Art, and a very good poet. Wrote a very casual style. In fact, he got into something that that was the way he started treating his poems like letters to people, and he was like everybody else I knew at that time in New York. He was influential. So running with these people, I had a lot of work to do to get to be in that class. And so I think, by the time I left New York, I think I had some respect as a poet in the poetry community. But during the first years, no, I didn't have my chops together enough.
And then just for the record, since we're documenting things, people said you had the last interview with Malcolm X that was in Rhythm magazine.
Was the last interview?
The last interview with Malcolm X. Did you do
I don't know that it was the last. I don't know that.
Okay. All right.
I don't know. I did have an interview with him.
Right.
It was in, it was published in a magazine called Revolution in Europe. It was in Paris, and it was also published in the Monthly Review. It was, he was a very gracious man. And I showed him all the questions at first and asked him if there was anything that he didn't want to talk about. And he said, no, he was open to anything. And he was very responsive directly with everything I chose to ask him. I met him a couple of times, and he was very approachable. But when you got there, you were standing in front of what would I call it? Like what would be a monument that is alive and still moving. That was what he was. He was very, not daunting, but your spine stiffened in his presence.
Okay.
I met Che Guevara once. I don't know if people know about that. Yeah, he came to New York and met with various writers on the left. I wore a suit to that meeting, which was a mistake, because he right away thought I was from the CIA. And I asked him a question, and he said, "That sounds like the question of a CIA agent." That was not necessarily a great experience.
Well, it did lead you to get a job with government. Back to you, Joy.
Those are all the comments and questions we have tonight. And I'd let Mayor Pratt have the last word. Thank you so much, Ethelbert, and thank you both the part 1 and the part 2 sections of this, Laurie, A.B. Spellman, and the jazz writers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, let me also join Joy in saying what a wonderful evening this is. And I can assure you, our social media network team will make certain that this wonderful experience is replicated and heard many times over through our various social media platforms. Ethelbert, you always pull together extraordinary events, and this is no exception. And in particular, I want to thank A.B. Spellman for enriching our community. The cultural enrichment you have provided to this community, to this city. I don't know whether it was Brother Jackson or Bobby Hill who said he talked about Dinah Washington and so forth. There's something, and I admit I'm unbiased. I mean, I am biased. I'm not unbiased about Washington, D.C. I think that there is something very special about this town. And though people may not be able to thrive here with their particular talent, we provide them, I think, with an agency that really launches a lot of genius out of this community, as reflected by, again, the Duke Ellingtons of the world. We hear the expression of the reference to the Harlem Renaissance. Granted, everyone thrived when they got to Harlem, but that very moniker was authored by a man who lived in Washington, D.C., and that was Elaine Locke at Howard University. Even people who made marks in politics, because that for a very long time, you couldn't do it here. The first Black U.S. senator since Reconstruction was from D.C., Eddie Brooke. You know, there is something about this town that provides agency to an awful lot of talent, but ultimately, because maybe we're a government town, I don't know, they have to go elsewhere. They have to go to New Orleans or Chicago or New York or Massachusetts to realize that full potential. And what is so wonderful about tonight's conversation is that you've talked about someone who has happily, consistently lived in this town, and who's been a force and influence for so many in the important spheres of both jazz and poetry. So it's been an honor to have this gathering of such extraordinary writers, Brother Hill, Brother Holly, Brother Jackson, who's a legend unto himself, Brother Jenkins, and Laurie Shire. All of you, I want to thank you so very much for a wonderful evening, and also thank you, Joy and Jody, for helping to make this happen.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Very
Many blessings,
much.
everyone.
Okay, take good care.
All right. Take
All
care.
right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ah.